issue of antigen testing erupted into a major controversy over the last week. But before we look at this controversy, it's important that we look at the background. Deputy Michael McNamara has for many months now been raising this issue in the Dáil. I want to take a look now at a video that dates to the 28th of January.
Before Christmas I called for greater use of antigen testing, or at least for the possibility of it to be explored in line with Commission recommendations. I note that it will now be used in respect of ports, but is there not a role for antigen testing in our hospitals, in our schools potentially when they open back up, and in our airports in the absence of quarantine, that perhaps you know, from safer countries at least, that people could use antigen testing to ensure that that travel is taking place in a safe manner?
Thanks, Deputy. I broadly agree that there is a role, and a greater role, for antigen testing in Ireland into the future. But we have to be guided by public health advice on this. And NPHET, as you know, haven't been particularly confident about the accuracy of antigen testing, and believe in many instances that it doesn't meet what the manufacturers say. But they have updated their guidance only in the last couple of days, so antigen testing is now going to be used more extensively for outbreaks and also for symptomatic cases. And they've actually changed the definition of case in Ireland to take into account the fact that somebody may test positive on an antigen test and not just on a PCR test. So that is a significant change only in the last couple of days. Using it, for example, to screen people for travel or to screen people to attend events is a whole other thing.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
And the evidence at the moment is that antigen testing is effective in symptomatic cases, but not so much for screening, but that may change.
Deputy Michael McNamara questioning the Taoiseach, the Leo Varadkar, on the 28th of January. And did you notice how the Taoiseach said that NPHET had changed the definition of a case to include a case that was involving antigen testing? So on the 18th of February, Deputy McNamara questioned the Taoiseach once again.
The European Commission have advocated the use of antigen testing. The Irish government said no, it wasn't good enough to take up the 20 million antigen tests offered by the European Commission. Wasn't good enough to facilitate visits to nursing homes, wasn't good enough to facilitate the return to school and make schools safer. But lo and behold, we woke up on Monday morning and we found out that the Department of Agriculture are facilitating the antigen testing of workers in meat plants. Workers who operate under bonded labour effectively, because the department, your department, won't change the work permit system. If it's good enough in this sector, why is it not good enough for others? My question is not about the decision. I don't disagree with the decision, but how are decisions made by your government? Because it seems strange that it couldn't be even looked at for every other sector. But when Larry and the lads rock up, it's yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir. So if every other country in the EU thinks that it's safe to use antigen testing, not as an alternative to PCR testing, not as a clinical diagnosis, but to get society back functioning again, what is the obstacle in Ireland?
I support the greater use of antigen testing in Ireland, and I'm on the record as having said that on a number of occasions, but that does have to be subject to public health advice and the approval of NPHET and HICWA as well, which advises on this too. It is now being used in outbreaks and it has been tested in some clinical scenarios such as outbreaks in hospitals. So it has been used in recent weeks under the direction of NPHET and the HSC. The problem with it is it misses a large number of positive cases, particularly asymptomatic cases. So whereas a PCR test might miss 15–20% of positives, an antigen test will miss many more positives, particularly asymptomatic cases, and that could give a false reassurance.
Taoiseach, this false positive and reassurance is a bit like the argument against giving out condoms during the HIV pandemic, that people would feel reassured and behave on that basis. Frankly, I don't buy it, because every single person who's detected is somebody who wouldn't otherwise be detected. It's not that we're taking people away from PCR testing to antigen testing. It's in addition to its screening. So I simply don't accept that argument.
That was Deputy Michael McNamara on the 18th of February. And then later on in the month, he questioned the Taoiseach Micheál Martin. This time, the issue was over the conflict of interest between ENFIT members and the laboratories that are doing the PCR testing.
The European Commission advocated greater use of antigen testing in November. It's been rolled out right across Europe. The Biden administration have now introduced far greater use of antigen testing in America, including in homes. Here, NEFIT have finally moved, and reluctantly, to a very circumscribed role for antigen testing in the context of outbreaks, and only in that context. Is there a conflict of interest between being chair of NEFIT and director of the National Virus Laboratory Institute, which has very large contracts with the state for PCR testing? And that's a simple, I'm not saying there's any subjective bias by that member of NEFIT, but there's a clear perception, there's objective bias, or a clear possibility of it. What is the reluctance to antigen testing? Because whatever opening up will take place in March will have to be done safely.
Thank you, Deputy.
And there is a role for antigen testing in our hospitals, in our schools, and especially in our homes. What is the reluctance in this state to that?
From what I can surmise and gather from the discussions I've had, they believe the PCR test is gold standard. They believe you can miss a lot through antigen testing. But that said, they have advised now that it can be used in outbreak settings. I think in any future committee engagements, for example, I know you chaired the COVID committee, so you would have, I presume, have discussed this and discussed zero COVID and all the range of issues that were brought before that committee throughout the summer. Yeah, in terms of, I think that's not, I wouldn't accept your point that there's a conflict of interest between being chair of NEFIT and being the director of the NVRL. I think, to be fair to all concerned, everybody has come together in different contexts to help the country defeat,
thank you, Taoiseach,
and suppress COVID-19. I think we should accept people's bona fides in that regard. And like, there's reluctance within the political sphere and within government sphere to override this kind of advice. We're not experts on. I'm not an expert in testing or the most efficacious.
Please, deputies.
No, but they have their experts. But I mean, we can't just pick and choose a la carte.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
There's structures within the country. There's a clinical advisory. There's public health advice.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
Dr. Cillian de Gascon chaired the expert advisory group, a subcommittee of ENFIT, until it was stood down before Christmas, and he remains a member of ENFIT. Dr. Gascon is also director of the National Virus Reference Laboratory. It has a state contract to do PCR testing that was worth 11.95 million in 2020. It also subcontracts PCR testing to other laboratories. ENFAR, the Tipperary diagnostic company controlled by businessman Louis Ronan, was last year paid 122.4 million to process COVID-19 tests. And now to the controversy that erupted last weekend when Lidl began to sell antigen tests. Lidl began selling the antigen tests for $24.99 per pack of 5. Speaking at Friday's ENFIT press briefing, Dr. Holohan warned people not to buy the Lidl antigen tests. He said, and I quote, "Someone could go into the supermarket and buy a pound of sausages and charcoal for a barbecue as well as a test. That represents a real test." We're going to look now at how the print media responded to Dr. Holohan's request. The Irish Mirror had a headline, "Dr. Tony Holohan slams Lidl antigen tests, warning people not to buy or use them." The Irish Examiner, "Don't rely on home testing kits for COVID, Tony Holohan urges." The Irish Times, "ENFIT warns public against relying on antigen tests being sold in supermarkets. Chief Medical Officer Tony Holohan genuinely concerned at sale of such kits." And finally, RTE, "CMO very concerned over supermarket antigen tests." Lidl's tongue-in-cheek tweet in response to Tony Holohan the next day was, "Weekend super savers, pick up a pound of sausages, charcoal for the barbecue and antigen tests for €31. It was the response to this tweet by Professor Philip Nolan, the president of Maynooth University and the chair of ENFIT's Irish Epidemiological Modelling Advisory Group, that caused a major hullabaloo. And I quote, "Can I get some snake eye with that? It makes for a very good salad dressing with a pinch of salt and sometimes something acerbic. These antigen tests will not keep you safe." Dr. Michael Mina is the Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at Harvard University. He tweeted on Sunday in reply to Nolan, and I quote, "For an advisor to your government, you don't appear to know what you're talking about. This comment adds nothing of benefit and further sows confusion. You should be ashamed of your demeanour here." The response from Irish mainstream media to a Harvard professor telling an ENFIT expert that he doesn't know what he's talking about is shocking and displays the almost 100% deference by the media to Tony Holohan and ENFIT for the last year. The Mirror headline, "Harvard expert tells ENFIT's Philip Nolan he should be ashamed over little tweet," is in stark contrast to Paul Cullen in the Irish Times online report under the heading, "Supermarket antigen test will not keep you safe." This report did not appear in Monday's print edition of the Times. Only the Mirror reported the Mina-Nolan controversy. That is up until Wednesday, when an opinion piece was carried by the Irish Independent. There was also a negative response to Nolan's tweet from medical professionals. Matter private consultant Michael Kavanagh accused ENFIT of grandstanding on the antigen test issue because they want to be in control of the data and the narrative. On Monday, ISME, the body that represents small and medium-sized businesses, wrote to the Minister for Health to express its serious concern with Tony Holohan and the chair of the Irish Epidemiological Modelling Advisory Group, Professor Philip Nolan, about the use of rapid antigen testing. In the letter, they said, and I quote, "They accuse the utility of rapid antigen testing in the workplace has clearly been described by experts in the World Health Organization, the Centre for Disease Control in the United States, and by the European Centre for Disease Control. If ENFIT is privy to scientific advice contrary to the guidance of these bodies, it should publish it immediately," the letter said. On Tuesday, Stephen Donnelly finally got around to describing the comment by Nolan as unhelpful and said antigen testing is one of the tools that can be used in the fight against COVID-19. And now I'm going to show you two videos. The first video is of Professor Mark Ferguson. He appeared by video link before the Joint Committee on Transport and Communication Network to discuss antigen testing on Wednesday, the 5th of May. Now, I haven't come across any mainstream media reports about this meeting, and we'll have a look at this short video clip from that meeting.
I think you need to understand that a PCR test and an antigen test are about different things. So since this is a transport committee, people often talk about the PCR test as being the Rolls-Royce test. Well, the kind of analogy is, if you can't have a Rolls-Royce car, you shouldn't have any car. But that's nonsense. You know, if I wanted to travel over Africa, I wouldn't choose a Rolls-Royce car, I'd choose a Land Rover. If I wanted to be green and save the planet, I would choose an electric car, not a Rolls-Royce that burns so much petrol per gallon. And what that tells you is that it depends what question you're asking. So a antigen test basically detects infectious people. It detects an individual who's got a high viral load that's likely to have live virus and that is likely to transmit that virus to other people. And that's what you want to do. You want to remove those infectious people from the workforce or from the aeroplane or from general society, get them to isolate until they're not infectious, and then you stop the spread of the virus. A PCR test detects the nucleic acid of a virus, and that tells you when you've got a very, very small amount of virus that isn't infectious. It tells you when you're infectious, and it tells you when you're post-infectious. In other words, that you're way over having had the symptoms, but you still got some traces of the nucleic acid. So these are detecting different things. An antigen test will not tell you whether you ever had COVID. It won't tell you whether you're past COVID. It just tells you whether you're infectious at this stage. And it's that kind of mentality of equating a PCR test with an antigen test that is actually unhelpful. I mean, they're detecting different things.
You have been looking there at Professor Mark Ferguson, who appeared by video link before the Joint Committee on Transport and Communications on Wednesday, the 5th of May. Professor Ferguson is the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Government. He's also chair of the COVID-19 Rapid Testing Group, and he is the Director General of Science Foundation Ireland. He was appointed by the EU Commission as only one of 12 members of a high-level group to work on research and innovation. In 1984, at the age of 28, Ferguson became the youngest ever professor in the UK, and he was awarded a CBE by the Queen in 1999 for services to health and life sciences. Now, we can see that Professor Ferguson is a very eminent scientist and very well qualified to speak about antigen and PCR tests. But the question is, why is he being stonewalled by the government? Professor Ferguson presented an expert report to the government on the 1st of April, calling for an immediate rollout of antigen testing to end lockdown. His report has been largely ignored by the government. Now, let's take a look at Tony Holohan, the Chief Medical Officer. And here he is speaking on Virgin Media News about antigen tests.
Dr. Holohan, you had expressed concern about antigen tests being sold in a German discounter there on Friday. And just to be clear, these antigen tests that they're selling, they are as effective or otherwise as an antigen test that you might get, for example, in a chemist, or that employers might be using in some circumstances across the country right now. Isn't that the case?
So antigen tests, we think, have a role to play. They have a role to play in controlled circumstances where studies have shown and demonstrated the impact that they can have in helping to prevent transmission and helping to pick up infection earlier. They don't perform as well as PCR tests, we know that, but we think they can have a role to play. The concern that we have is if the general public starts to use them, first of all, they don't perform as well as they do when healthcare staff use them, and second of all, the risk of a negative test leading people to believe inappropriately that they're somehow free of the disease, when even in healthcare trained professional hands, we're looking at about an average of 50% sensitivity in many of the studies that have been conducted. It means we simply would miss too many cases and give people false reassurance that they don't have the disease, and if that led them to behave in ways where they were to facilitate the spread of the disease, we would be very, very concerned about that.
Right.
So we're really advising people not to go out and buy these antigen tests and to use them themselves.
All right, finally, Dr. Holohan, just on vaccines, are you planning on vaccinating children? And do you think on that Johnson & Johnson, that one...
I think, having looked at the video of Professor Ferguson appearing before the Oireachtas Transport Committee and Tony Holohan speaking to Virgin Media News that there is a clear conflict in their views on antigen testing. Now, we've seen that Professor Mark Ferguson is an eminently qualified scientist. Let's look a little bit closely now at Tony Holohan's qualifications. He graduated from medical school in UCD in 1991, and then he graduated with a master's in public health in 1996. He also has a diploma in healthcare management from the Royal College of Surgeons. Tony Holohan was appointed Deputy Chief Medical Officer in 2001, and then he was promoted to Chief Medical Officer in December 2008. Approximately 100 people are currently taking cases against the state in relation to the swine flu vaccine pandemics made by GlaxoSmithKline, who were indemnified by the state against compensation claims. The legal fees were $6 million in the first case settled by the HSE with Aoife Bennett, who has developed lifelong ailments as a result of being given the swine flu vaccine. The second compensation claim was settled with Ben Blackwell for just under $1 million. He was represented in court by barrister Dermot Gleeson, senior counsel. Mark Tighe reported in the Sunday Times on the 8th of November last, and I'm going to read now from that report. Gleeson told the judge that Blackwell's case involved harsh criticism of public health officials, including Dr. Tony Holohan, who was Chief Medical Officer in 2009. The barrister said the evidence would include transcripts of media interviews given by Holohan at the time, in which he assured the public that pandemics had been fully tested and was as safe as regular flu vaccines. Blackwell's senior counsel said this was untrue, as pandemics contained a new adjuvant, a booster ingredient that triggers an autoimmune response which had not been used previously and which had not been tested on children. Gleeson quoted interviews that Holohan did on RTE and News Talk at the time, in which he said pandemics was fully licensed and clinically tested, and like all other influenza vaccines, which had an excellent safety profile. On one radio show, Holohan said the adjuvant in pandemics was nothing new, but Gleeson insisted it was completely new. He added, "We say people weren't told the truth." Fast forward from the swine flu in 2009 to the scandal that erupted in 2018 over the false negative smear test results that came to light when Vicky Phelan settled her case against the state. Vicky is one of more than 200 women who developed cancer that was not diagnosed in time, some of whom have died. Holohan was one of the key players in this fiasco. In the wake of the scandal, he defied calls for his resignation and defended not telling Leo Varadkar, who was health minister at the time, and his successor Simon Harris about the compensation claims the department was facing over giving the women false smear test results. Now, this raises three questions about Tony Holohan. Was it incompetence? Was he so in control of the department and calling all the shots that Varadkar and later Harris were mere puppets? Or, thirdly, could it be that he told Varadkar and later told Harris, and in order to save their political careers, he lied for them? In 2019, the Irish Examiner, using freedom of information, discovered that on the day after Vicky Phelan settled her case and called for a public inquiry into the scandal, Holohan emailed the Health Minister Simon Harris advising him not to have a public inquiry. To his credit, Simon Harris ignored Holohan and went ahead with an inquiry led by Professor Gabriel Scally. On Tuesday night last, RTE's Primetime did a feature on antigen testing. Strangely, it completely left out any reference to Professor Mark Ferguson the chief scientific advisor to the government, or to his appearance before the Dáil Transport Committee that we have just seen in the video clip a few minutes ago, or reference to his expert report to government calling for a speedy rollout of antigen testing. Instead, they had Ray Wally, a Dublin-based GP, telling anecdotal stories of his experience of patients using antigen tests to counter arguments that were being put forward by Harvard epidemiologist Dr. Michael Mina, who had told NPHET's Professor Nolan that he should be ashamed of his non-scientific attitude towards antigen testing that we examined a few moments ago. Dr. Mina appeared by remote link on primetime. We'll now look at what he tweeted after his appearance. And I quote, "Surprise at lack of trust the government has in the Irish people. Instead of supporting access to simple at-home tests to tell if you're infectious, the position appears to be to limit access because they don't trust people to handle a negative test. We do not defeat a pandemic without properly engaging and trusting in the public. To actively advocate against an asymptomatic person to be able to access a rapid test that has a very high sensitivity to tell you if you're spreading the virus doesn't make sense. Overall, though, there seems to be confusion among decision makers in Ireland that these tests are not sensitive. Rapid tests do a very good job at detecting you when you are infectious, which is what matters if you're using a rapid test." And so now, I suppose the big really issue is so much controversy now around Dr. Michael Mina and his response to what is actually happening here in Ireland, and it really goes against it really goes against what is happening elsewhere. Just for the record, since the beginning of April, if you live in Northern Ireland, you can register online and antigen tests are posted free to your address, and they are also available free in pharmacies. And the big question now is, why is there so much resistance in NPHET and in the government to the rollout of antigen testing? And secondly, why is mainstream media promoting everything that Tony Holohan is saying? And very few, if anybody, knows that the government actually has a chief scientific officer and advisor in Professor Mark Ferguson. We're going to finish now by looking at a video clip of Stephen Donnelly's appearance this morning on Virgin Media with Pat Kenny, and just note the interjections from Pat Kenny in the course of the interview.
So this isn't like putting on a mask. There's a lot of serious work has to be done to make sure that people are using the right test in the right way. And then what we've got to do is really get the message out there that if you're using the right test in the right way, and if you get a positive result, you should go and get a PCR test. If you get a negative result,
that is the advice.
Yeah, but
here's the advice.
It is, but the next bit is just as important, which is if you get a negative result, you should pretty much ignore it. It doesn't mean you're negative. The best tests used in the best ways are about 50% accurate. Some of them are as low as 3 or 4% accurate. And that's the key. The real fear that people
Stephen,
have is...
this is bad. This is propaganda. This is not fact. I mean, the science indicates that properly used antigen testing reveals when people are infectious. I mean, that is the science. And now you're telling me that only one test works, and that, you know...
No, let me be clear. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an expert in this stuff. What I'm saying to you is that the Cochrane report, which is a well-regarded review, they found that only one single test, when you follow the manufacturer's instructions, met the minimum stipulated sensitivity and specificity, and that there is a wide variety of sensitivity, which is the positives, and some of the pilots have shown accuracy of about 3%, but others have shown accuracy in excess of 50%. The point being, Pat, if you get one of these tests and you get a negative, it doesn't mean you're negative. That's the most important thing to take away.
Stephen, you're actually saying it's pointless. There's no point in buying you're in favour of them, but there's no point in doing them. That, people cannot be trusted to do it properly. And even if they are trusted to do it properly, but it's probably wrong. That's what you're saying. You cannot have it both ways, that you're in favour of them and then you disparage them.
Well, let me tell you why I think you can. I'm not disparaging them, Pat. What I'm saying is
they're useless by your last commentary. They are useless, which is not what the international experience is.
And it's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is, if you get a negative result, under no circumstances does that mean that you are not infectious. And please don't behave as if you have a result that says you're not infectious. It's really important.